Good afternoon and welcome to S24 Insight, a fresh edition. You know, news tells us what happened. Documentary asks why, who was affected, who benefits, who suffers, and what must not be forgotten. In a world of breaking news, viral clips, propaganda, and shrinking attention spans, documentary film may be one of the last places where society is forced to slow down and look properly. Today, we ask a simple but powerful question. Can storytelling help us understand current affairs more deeply than headlines ever can? Joining me again is John Costa, S24's Director of Strategy, Research and Global Partnerships, and also a documentarian, a storyteller, teacher, and a media strategist. John, welcome to S24 Insight again. It's really an interesting topic because I know that's your mainstay, and also I love to look into documentary because I think that's the new in thing. That's the only thing that feels like it's not phasing out for us today. So let's start with the fact that documentary is sometimes misconstrued for maybe the short films, maybe the news space that we see on our dailies. So we begin with foundation. Why does storytelling matter in journalism and public life?
I think it's important because it's where we understand the subjects of the headlines. Headlines are very much about who, what, and where, what happened, invariably how many people died, whose fault it was. Whereas when you start telling real stories about individuals, particularly those that are impacted, it allows you to get more of an understanding as to why these things have happened. But also for those that are interested enough, it actually starts to make you think about, well, why has it happened again? Why does this sound familiar? What's going on where this is now normalized to the point where we're no longer shocked by these things happening in multiple locations? And that's what we've lost really in our kind of mainstream media and journalism now. It's become about the 24/7 filling of the airwaves with news and constant stuff. But actually, if you take the time to sit and watch a bulletin at 5 o'clock in the evening, it's not much different from the bulletin you got at 7 in the morning and the lunchtime show, because things don't change that often. So that's why I think people are more interested in social media than sitting and watching the news. But the news hasn't adapted for providing those shows, and that's really where you see things like TikTok and Instagram Reels have been able to fulfill that, where shows are live streamed, phone-ins have become popular again, watching a documentary has become popular again. I always see it very much like an analog. A documentary is an antidote to a news headline because it makes you sit and put yourself in the situation of the person that's ultimately what the story is about.
That's resonant. There are a lot of things going on in the world, and because the news make it feel it's normal. People are being killed every day. It's normal. Let's just move past it. It makes it very resonant for me. And because I want us to be able to be delving into the impacts of the things that we see on our mental well-being and all of that. For you, when you come across the word story, some people think it's just entertainment. But in documentary and current affairs, story is evidence, memory, emotion, and accountability. How do you define it?
For me, documentary is actuality. It's real life. I think it's about how people are experiencing the world, how people are experiencing even great joy doing a festival, something traditional. It's about why is it important to them? Why is it impactful? And so it can be linked with heritage and culture and tradition, but it also can be linked with, why have our people always been oppressed? But maybe thinking about also, well, as someone from the global north, the impact of colonialism on somewhere that I know and love and I work, you have to be prepared to challenge yourself. And I find that someone who's interested in documentaries and particularly in storytelling is actually more empathetic to a human being. And I find you can't teach empathy. People care or they don't. And as soon as you know whether someone cares or they don't, is normally, if you have a conversation about documentary, they go, well, why would you watch that? I've not got the time. But then the flip side of that is also talking to young people who, a 17-year-old young person here in Abuja with a creative side hustle. If they're using TikTok to tell their story, that is documentary. We need to also be challenging the accepted norms within genres.
Yes. So what makes a documentary different from a news report?
I think a news report is about now, and it's almost like it's live, and it's about current affairs, what's going on. maybe the impact on people, whereas a documentary is more about taking its time to build a narrative that explains maybe broader, maybe gets you thinking about people that you wouldn't think would be impacted by that particular subject. I mean, I do a lot of conflict memory, and that's very much around, it's not about war fighting, it's about the impact of conflict in its broadest sense on combatants and on non-combatants, civilians, displaced people. And what you find is as soon as a war finishes, a combatant invariably becomes a victim. Not everybody will then go back and be the person that they were before, what's happened or what they've seen or witnessed or participated in impacts on them. And so what you've got is, we're seeing it at the moment with Russia and Ukraine, with, Russian soldiers that are coming back, violence, domestic violence, sexual violence. When you weaponize people to do something like that, it comes back into society at some point if you're not prepared for it.
Unfortunately, and that's a sad reality, I think, across the globe. We need to do something about it, maybe. Can a 90-second news package tell the truth?
A 90-second news package tell the truth? I would say, to an extent, it can inform you, but being informed is very different from understanding. Particularly here with the new doc unit with S24, we're driven by context, understanding, providing that depth, making sure that we can get as many people that were there participating. And the story that I told someone recently as well, a good friend of mine who's a combat journalist, was making a book about a particular battle. So he got 15 people from one side and 15 people from another side. On the other side, so one man's terrorist was another man's freedom fighter, and one's aggressor was a liberator. And he got a map out, and which really resonated with me as a documentarian. He got a map out and got them to mark on there where all 30 of them were in the map. Well, of course, what anybody who understands combat is, normally you've got your head down like this and fog of war. So you had 30 different versions of the same battle that had been written and documented, and this is what had happened by the group that won. But then when you took into account the 15 people that were on the losing side, their interpretation of what happened actually gave you the real understanding of what had happened in that battle. Now, how many times in society have we seen a mainstream headline or a report that comes out, supposedly live, supposedly with the victims, supposedly with the people that did it, that completely misses the mark because it doesn't stand up the test of time with tomorrow's headlines and in a month's time. And then as soon as you start getting into collective memory of massacres and who did this and, civil wars and things like that, what you find is that something that happened 60 years ago can impact a political election now just as much as a piece of disinformation or misinformation on social media 20 minutes ago.
When a society moves too fast from one crisis to another, which we see today clearly everywhere, what role does documentary play in forcing remembrance?
It plays an absolutely vital role, actually, and I can give you an example of that. I'm on the board of jurors for the Kaduna International Film Festival, and one of them was about a landfill slippage in Uganda, and it came down and killed lots of people, this thing, and there'd all the missed opportunities about it was moving, like the noise and stuff like that. And, you've got politicians that are standing there going like, we'll look after the victims afterwards and we'll make sure that everybody that lost everything is that. Well, this documentary was very much around what had happened and what the news coverage was and that had gone on. Well, of course, for me, and this fitted really well with the S24 doc unit, is we're not going to make those documentaries. We're going to make documentaries that are in three parts, which is what's the impact of what happened, which is the one that these people had made. Then we go back and say, well, everybody that was promised everything, who lost everything, did they get anything at all? Were they looked after, the victims? And then the third documentary is, well, how many times has this happened around the world in the last 12 months? And what are we doing? Is there a solution to monitoring dangerous landfill sites that are slipping and killing innocent people? So we've got to not just turn around and say documentaries are the answer. It's the kind of documentaries you make about those subjects that are the thing that is impactful, because it's getting people to think about the longer term impacts of things. In
your experience, when does a story become powerful enough to change the way people think?
It's really interesting. We had this question at the Northern Film Summit recently in Abuja, and it's more about can a single documentary impact either policy or people's views? Yes, it can. Yes, it can, without a doubt, but only if it's done in a way where it's combined with other media. So for me, for example, I would never show a documentary film in a public setting or a group of people without a Q&A, question and answer afterwards. And this is the thing I think where the streaming platforms fall down. Netflix and Amazon and those kind of things have driven a demand for people to make documentaries, but you're still watching a documentary on your own about a really impactful subject, okay? So mental health being one, hopefully they put something at the end, which is if you've experienced any of these things, reach out and get in touch with us. But when you start talking about the impact maybe on societies, of conflicts, climate change, people are losing their home in the Pacific now. For them, climate change is real because they're no longer on that island, they live somewhere else. It's only when you start taking the time to watch those documentaries, but then get a group of people together to have a Q&A with the person that made it. What did you leave out? Why did you stop at that person? Who was the main person you were going to make the documentary about? And every time I've ever done a Q&A with a documentary filmmaker is you realise that what you've just watched, which was 17 minutes, 77 minutes, 90 minutes, they've probably got 10 times that an amount of footage, but there's no commercial value to it. And that's really what I want us to do with the doc unit, which is thinking about, is this a piece of one standalone rapid content? If it is, let's do it. But what happens next? It's not making 10 episodes of the same thing. It's about, let's make 3 episodes of things that are linked to this, and we're starting to build understanding in a broader way, not just deeper knowledge on the subject, but actually starting to link things together. Because that's the great thing that the mainstream media does, is it gets us thinking of these things in isolation when they happen. But when you start thinking about, well, are these things dangerous everywhere? Then that's when you're really going to start seeing maybe the public changing its view of climate change much more, when they realise that, the environmental damage is happening to everybody else, not just to you, or it's not happening to you, so you don't care.
That's really immersive, because I'm just trying to rewind all of these things in my mind and thinking about the way we do it better, especially with our doc unit. So, if news captures the moment, documentary captures the meaning. But meaning can also be manipulated. That brings us to truth. We'll explore that when we come back from this break. Stay with us. We'll be right back. Welcome back. If you're just joining us, it's still S24 Insight, and we've been talking about documentary or storytelling with John Costa, our lead consultant, and also the Director of Strategy, Research and Global Partnerships. And we need to talk about truth, power, and responsibility when it comes to documentary. So documentary filmmaking often deals with pain, and it deals with conflict, injustice, memory, and power. How do you think filmmakers tell the truth without exploiting people's sufferings?
That's a really good question, because I think what tends to happen is the mainstream media is, even though it alludes to be empathetic towards or appears to be sympathetic towards the victim, it's more about what's the most exploitative or clickbait version of what we can report that gets people watching it or reading it or listening to it on our news platform. And that's where we've lost the ability to tell stories, I think. Documentary is more about being able to tell a story, create meaning, context, maybe depth, relevance, connectivity with other things. And so we really need to be thinking about, if we're going to tell a story from a documentary perspective, it's sometimes not straight at the subject. It's more about what's the subject impacting on, or why was that a particular incident. And I think what people don't understand about documentary is that it's long and it's boring, okay? And maybe it's like educational. Some people have an experience of watching documentaries at school and will never watch another documentary again, whereas in fact what they're missing out on is, if you've not got that through education or through a mentor or someone that, you're in a situation where people explains that to you, who's got experience and elder, a documentary gives you the ability in a time length that you can choose. And if you want to get it from TikTok, that's who you are because of your generation. If you want to sit and take 90 minutes to immerse yourself, the story should not be any different told in 90 seconds or 90 minutes. It's about the examples that you use to prove to someone that that's the impact on someone. Truth, I think, is not really something that is the right term, because the truth to you could be different from the truth to me, because that's my experience, you know. So when you then look
Truth can be subjective.
when you look at, you know, aggression particularly, and I keep coming back to the Civil War, that, you know, just because that's the official narrative from a government perspective or institutions written in books or out of the mouth of people that are accepted as elders and historians and respected, if that's a complete counter to my experience or my family's experience, particularly if I'm second, third, fourth generation, that intergenerational trauma of that event, then I could turn around and say, well, I'm going to vote in this presidential election that's upcoming, whereas actually we're still not listened to, we're still not respected, and nothing has changed over 60 years. You're never going to get rid of that through a news headline. You're only going to get rid of that by people being brought together to watch a documentary that's made about, for the first time, maybe telling a version of the truth that you can resonate with, that you think, well, I've been listened to.
So where is the ethical line between emotional storytelling and emotional manipulation?
Again, I think it's your version of the truth is different from my version. You know, what's acceptable ethically for you when it comes to the manipulation of a story. I think it's one of those debates that you can have about lots of different subjects as to, you know, do I have to shock you with something in order for you to change? And I think this is really where documentarians end up being making like public service announcement adverts or music videos, ironically, would you believe that? That it's about storytelling, and sometimes it's about impact. You know, if you watch like, you know, public service announcement adverts in Australia, for example, some of their road traffic accidents are horrific. I mean, like people going through windscreens, you see the aftermath and stuff like that. Yet when you watch a lot of the news from the global south, you'll see the impact of an IED or a suicide bomber or a plane crash. There'll be bodies. Whereas when you go to the global north, it's very much about blurring things out and stuff like that. You all know what it is. So why aren't we adult enough to make the judgment that quite clearly people have died? And it's like, you know, viewer discretion. Some people might be upset by this. Good, you need to be, because it keeps happening. And the only reason way it's going to stop is when you care. And so I think documentarians have a really important role to play in actually pushing that narrative, that agenda, if you want, you know, that kind of manipulation to making people care again. So that version of manipulation, I guess, is acceptable. The one that isn't is when it's you're hiding the truth and you're trying to mask something, or you're setting a particular viewpoint, and that's really where you start straying into propaganda when it comes to documentaries, which was quite clearly, that's been repurposed, and you're seeing it a lot with Russia and Ukraine at the moment about, you know, who is and who isn't worthy of keeping their culture. And I know a lot of Ukrainians in the UK, and we've made documentaries and we do projects and looking to do school projects, but that's not about just doing it now, that's about the aftermath. We're talking about every conflict at some point ends around a table with dialogue, and people lay firearms down, and then we get back into that, who tells what actually happened to them. So
can documentary be neutral?
I don't think a documentary should be neutral. I think I would much rather watch two documentaries that are balanced in the view that they've taken about who they interview. They shouldn't be neutral. It's for you to decide whether they went far enough in the telling of the stories. I think if you set out to be balanced, it's quite hard. Mm-hmm. That's in a news show or a documentary. In conflict reporting, insecurity, displacement, poverty, or governance failure, how do you protect the dignity of people being filmed? I think it's about them understanding why you're there. I remember when we were here in November and we went to Katsina at the invitation of the state governor, and we went out onto the streets and people came up to me and were asking why we were there, you know. So we're on the street, we're making content, you know. At the time there'd been, you know, the American president said he was going to attack Nigeria, and there was a lot of confusion in the mainstream media about what was going on and all that. And there was this guy from the UK standing with S24, filming on the street and talking to people. And I was talking to people in English and you were talking to people in Hausa. And then people came up to me, it was like, some guy came up to me and said, thank you for coming. Because he said, because it just shows that you're not scared to be here. So therefore, even if people still want to believe that, they'll then ask why you're here, and then maybe start thinking about, well, if he's there, maybe it's not as bad as they say. And it was really quite impactful, because we were surrounded by all these people and children and everything that was going on. And this guy just coming up and said, thanks for taking the time to come. And I think that's what a documentary is. It's not news. It's about taking the time to, turn up, get beyond the headline, dive into the story, try and find the people that were really impacted on that. And, were people really helped by this government minister who turned up and said, everybody who's lost their home won't be impacted? Now, if you were to go back to that landfill site in Uganda, I should imagine those people have a very similar experience to Americans who were in the New Orleans flood, about how they were not looked after afterwards. And this is really where suddenly you start building empathy between someone in Uganda and someone in America, is when they suddenly realise that what they were promised never actually transpired.
That's really immersive. Now let's bring this back to our current reality. Nigeria and Africa are full of stories, but not all stories are told with depth, context, or dignity. Mr. John, what kinds of Nigerians or African stories do you think are underdocumented?
I think anything that's before well documented in the global north, colonial times, everything was kind of eradicated and not seen as being worthy, particularly the impact on religions that were imposed on people, and certain practices where people were not treated with respect, either as individuals and humans and become victims of human trafficking, or just that their knowledge was even worthy. And of course, the irony is that as someone like myself, who likes to consider myself not clever, but worldly wise, willing to immerse myself in other cultures and learn things as a documentarian, but also as a humanitarian, I guess, that you suddenly realise that what is seen as negative from the global north looking at the global south is actually the thing that's the most positive about the global south, because it's about community and resilience and being able to deal with tragedy and circumstances and the environment. Yet I said to someone after my last trip to Nigeria, if I lost my wallet in Abuja and I was on the street on my own and I'd lost my wallet, I would, without doubt, if I was able to explain and articulate my situation to any individual, they would pick me up, they'd drive me somewhere, they'd make sure I was okay, they'd ring someone, they'd feed me, they'd volunteer someone to take me to the embassy to replace my passport, they would lend you money, they'd all of that. If that happened to me where I live, no one would give you the time of day. So who's got the better society? It's just that what we're doing in Nigeria is we're not telling our story to the outside world. And that's one of the things that I think, particularly with the doc unit and what we're doing here at S24, by telling an authentic, genuine version of Northern Nigeria that Northern Nigerians resonate with, will we only then start getting other Nigerians from the south who may have a particular view of the north to suddenly realise, well, if you're saying that your life is like this, I'm not getting my version of your life through Nollywood or Conniewood. I'm getting it through an organisation that's set up to tell those stories. But that's a Pan-African thing. And there's lots of people that are doing it well. So how do we connect with them? And that's when we start changing the narrative of the African continent from being the heart of darkness and, pot-bellied children starving and people living in mud huts, which is still the stereotype the global north has because of Live Aid and other support programs like that. But start telling people about innovation and, going yesterday and seeing someone building drones and stuff like that, and it's made here. We don't need to be buying drones from Ukraine. We need to be making drones here that are doing farming, monitoring, surveillance to make people safe spaces for them to go back to.
Yeah. So this brings me to a really personal question for S24. If we want to become a serious documentary and current affairs institution, what must we build first? Research discipline, thought production capacity, editorial courage, archive systems, or distribution? What should we build first?
I think we need to build the right team, people that are empathetic enough to tell the stories, because it takes time. It takes time to plan. It takes time to think about where we should be going, who has got the genuine stories. You know my version of AI, which is actual intelligence going out and actually speaking to someone, good old-fashioned journalism, who maybe experienced it but has never told their story. If you amplify that story and tell it, it's then available for artificial intelligence to find. So be known as an organisation or an institution that goes out and tells stories that versions have been heard, but is a small jigsaw that adds to it. And I think what happens then is that builds trust and understanding with people, that what you're trying to do is be empathetic to them, not as an audience, but as people that really matter. And I think people will then come forward with stories to tell you. And, we're not a traditional news organisation. I don't think we need to be whistleblowing things and all that sort of stuff, because it never works out well for the whistleblower, and but also the fact that there's plenty of other organisations and institutions in the media that are interested in that. What no one's taking the time to do is provide the context behind some of these such stories.
So a story without structure becomes noise. A story without evidence becomes propaganda. So now let's talk just one more thing about craft. When you begin a documentary or current affairs feature, where do you start?
It has to be with the story structure, beginning, the middle, and end. And the simplest example I always use is go home, speak to the youngest child in your house, or go and borrow your niece or nephew or your grandson or granddaughter, read them a bedtime story and say, Jack and Jill went up the hill, good night. The smallest child will turn around and go, well, hang on. They get to the top of the hill and then something happens afterwards, And so where do we lose that ability when we're young to enjoy stories and being told stories? We become adults and then suddenly it's about shortcuts and it's about quick fixes and it's about headlines and clickbait. So I would say, using that analogy, the mainstream media is Jack and Jill went up the hill. And what we don't have, great analogy, isn't it? We don't have, because it's so simple. We just then don't have the context to what happened after, and what was the long-term impact of, them falling down the hill. And so that's mainstream media, is they went up the hill. Everything else that comes afterwards, in whatever form that is, whether that's podcasts, whether that's documentary films, whether that's photo essays, it's about building that middle and an end to the story arc. So
finally, just a brief response before we go rapid fire very quickly. If one young Nigerian wants to begin telling serious stories today, what should they do first?
Look outside their front door, because the story that needs to be told is never somewhere else, is never overseas. And that's the illusion that we sell. To be this thing, you have to go somewhere else. Mm-hmm. What you have to do is be the person that probably for the first time valued what happened outside your door and the impact on that. That builds real empathy. Street children, the impact of long-term unemployed, disability. Why are women still not valued in the workplace? Why is there a glass ceiling? All of those stories are right there with people that you live with inside your house and your community and your street. You'll find the best way to develop your craft is start telling those stories, because then when you get the dream job you want, which is being the men's football team correspondent, sports journalist at the next World Cup in 20 years' time, you'll be good at your craft, because journalism and the media is a craft. It's banging, you've got to bang on the anvil, or you've got to do the hard work, bit of rat-like cunning, and be mildly interested and possibly good at what you do. But it's about people, building connections.
Thank you so much. And let's quickly do rapid fire, very short answers.
I'm always scared of these.
Yes, and so we can call it a wrap. John, short answer, sharp. Let's start with news or documentary.
Documentary.
Speed or depth.
Depth.
Emotion or evidence.
Evidence.
Character or issue.
Issues.
Camera or research.
Research.
Script or instinct.
Script.
Local story or global story.
Local story.
One mistake young filmmakers must stop making.
That the story's somewhere else.
One documentary every journalist should study.
Oh, that's a good one. There's so many. One good one that journalists should study. I think anything by John Pilger, simply because he's a journalist that's got into storytelling really well, that's not really around anymore.
Complete this. A powerful story is?
The antidote for the future.
Thank you so much again for joining us on this edition, John. It's been really amazing because maybe it's our field. It makes it really more immersive and interesting. Today's conversation reminds us that stories are not soft. Stories are power, and they decide what a society remembers, what it ignores, what it confronts, and what it chooses to repair. In a world drowning in content, documentary gives us something rare: depth, memory, and consequence. So we leave you with this question. If we do not tell our own stories with truth, dignity, and courage, who will tell them for us, and what will they leave out? I am Halima Abdurrauf, and this is S24 Insight. Bye for now.